The courtroom smelled of polished oak and latent tension. Morning light streamed through high vertical windows, casting long shadows across the gray carpet and the stiff faces not frozen by cold, but by waiting. This wasn't an ordinary trial. Beneath legal arguments and exhibits lay a deeper question. When a black man is beaten in police custody, where does justice stand? Amara Johnson stood at the center not just of the room, but of a slow-burning collision between power and truth. She wasn't a famous attorney, but here, representing Darnell Hayes, a 22-year-old black man with a ruptured spleen and broken jaw after an arrest, she was the last line of hope. Her indirect opponent sat near the front, former Officer Gregory Hill, a veteran who had done nothing as his colleague beat Darnell into unconsciousness. Amara wasn't easily shaken. Raised by a single mother wrongfully jailed when Amara was 10, she had long learned that justice wasn't something given, it was something you had to build, brick by brick. Today, she didn't expect to face not just cross-examination, but physical confrontation. She began her closing statement with a voice neither trembling nor raised, each word clear as steel. Darnell Hayes did not resist. He carried no weapon, and when he was beaten, no one protected him. The dashcam video is clear. Officer Daniels threw the punches, but Officer Gregory Hill, standing just 3 steps away, did not intervene. He didn't report it, and not a single line in the incident report mentions the assault. She lifted her eyes to the jury. They listened, but Hill shifted in his seat. Though retired, he'd been granted a front row seat as a former witness. He would not stay seated. As Amara used the word complicity, he stood, stepped forward, and said gruffly, "Your Honor, I request this attorney be removed. She's slandering law enforcement and disturbing court order." The room froze. No one spoke, because what they saw wasn't merely an objection, it was a man wielding authority long left unchallenged. To silence a black woman in a courtroom, Amara turned to him. Her gaze was unflinching. She replied, her voice firm, "I am the attorney of record in this case. You have no authority here, not as a former officer, and certainly not as a civilian." Hill stepped closer. "I'm maintaining order." "No, you're proving that intimidation survives even after the badge is gone." He reached toward her sleeve, barely a touch, but enough to send a current of indignation through the room. Judge Rachel Moore, a composed white woman known for her restraint, struck her gavel. "Officer Hill, return to your seat immediately." But he didn't. His movement, small, deliberate, became a symbol of unchecked authority still demanding obedience. Amara didn't step back. She met his eyes and spoke not in legalese, but with the force of moral clarity. "If you touch me again, I will file for assault and obstruction right here, in court, in front of a sitting judge. As a practicing attorney, do it, and you will make my case for me." The silence that followed was deeper than any gavel strike. Hill backed away. No one spoke, because the truth had already been spoken. Judge Moore leaned forward. Her voice sharpened. "Officer Hill, you are ordered to leave the courtroom. Bailiff, escort him out." No one clapped. No one smiled. This was not a victory. It was a moment where justice, fragile and flickering, was held in place by the resolve of a woman who refused to bow before the courtroom fixated on her. There was a quiet Friday morning. Amara Johnson sat alone in the attorney's room, hands resting atop a stiff legal folder marked confidential, FOIA. Inside, a dashcam video, 60 seconds of silence that spoke volumes. Evidence the police department hadn't volunteered, obtained only after her Freedom of Information Act request. The footage was short, but in those 60 seconds, Officer Daniels shoved Darnell into a squad car and punched him twice in the abdomen while his hands were cuffed. And standing nearby, just a few paces away, was Gregory Hill, still, arms at his sides, eyes watching, doing nothing. Amara had watched that video a dozen times, not just to confirm facts, but to understand what could make a man with decades of experience choose silence. She didn't know, but she knew this. That silence was part of the harm. She froze the video on Hill's face, expressionless, unreadable. He hadn't needed to swing a fist. His inaction had written its own sentence. That silence, that compliance, was the culture she had come to court to put on trial. She hadn't shared the video with anyone, not her colleagues, not even her mother. She knew truth needed the right moment to strike, not a premature roar. Naming Hill in court wasn't just strategy, it was moral obligation. But she hadn't expected Hill to rise, to step forward, to interrupt with the same authority he'd used to stand above suspects for years. No longer a cop, but still demanding silence. He didn't shout. He didn't swing. But his eyes seethed not with offense, but with fear, the fear of being exposed. She had seen that look before from teachers who doubted her, bankers who side-eyed her, officers who stopped her for driving a too nice car. Gregory Hill didn't hate her. He feared her. He feared that her voice might pull back the curtain and that this time someone might actually look, and when he touched her sleeve, gently, just enough to signal dominance, the past flooded in. Her mother's mugshot, her brother Malik, wrongfully detained at 12 because of a matching hoodie, the principal whispering to a teacher, did they really test that well? She had learned then, justice didn't arrive on its own. You had to stand where others expected you to sit. Now, in court, she felt that same trial, not of law, but of will. No one intervened, not the judge, not the bailiff, as if the room was waiting to see if she would flinch, but Amara did not. She held Hill's gaze not in anger, but in certainty. Her words, quiet and honed, if you touch me again, I will record, I will file, and I will hold you accountable, not because I must win, but because the record must speak. Hill paused, hand in air. He had never stood across from someone who would not flinch. Amara turned to the bench. If this courtroom allows intimidation of counsel, then it is no longer a space for justice. It is a relic of authority unbound. Judge Moore hesitated, but when their eyes met, something moved. A small tectonic shift. The gavel struck, louder. Officer Hill, leave the courtroom. Bailiff escorted him out. Amara did not blink, did not smile. She did not need to. A woman stood in a space meant to constrain her and did not yield. A straight gaze, a clear truth, a single touch in a boundary drawn. Justice would not be dragged away today. The next morning, the courtroom was quieter, but heavier. The echo of the previous day had not faded. News hadn't broken. There was no press frenzy. But among the people in the pews, law clerks, junior attorneys, interns, there was an undeniable shift. Something unspoken had happened. A line had been drawn. Someone had refused to move. Judge Rachel Moore entered without eye contact. She sat straighter than usual before the proceedings resumed. She called a sidebar not for legal strategy, but for institutional order. In her chambers, she sat across from Amara and the opposing counsel, her voice controlled but tense. We are now at the center of something larger than this case, she began. Yesterday cannot repeat itself. This court must remain intact. Amara looked directly at her. I agree, Your Honor. That is why I didn't back down. The opposing counsel shifted, uneasy. They knew what the subtext was. If the court allowed an ex-officer to physically intimidate a black female attorney mid-trial, it risked becoming the story, not the plaintiff, not the facts, but the institution's complicity. Judge Moore didn't respond to the comment. Instead, she turned to Amara with something different in her tone, not empathy, but recognition. You will proceed, uninterrupted. Back in the courtroom, Amara resumed. Her presence was now different, not louder, not triumphant, but unshaken. She picked up her final statement with a deliberate pace. She did not return to Hill. She returned to Darnell. We are not here to punish history, she told the jury. We are here to name it, to stop it from repeating in silence. One juror, a white man in his 50s, shifted in his seat. For the first time writing notes, Amara's voice never rose, but now it carried more than law. It carried lived memory. Hill was gone, but the ripple he left remained, like smoke clinging to cloth. That afternoon, Judge Moore made a rare gesture. From the bench, she addressed the courtroom, not just the jury, but everyone. This court respects decorum, but not at the expense of dignity. Yesterday's incident is under internal review. Let us now return to the facts. It was subtle, but it was public. A signal that the room had changed. In the hallway after the session, a young Latina clerk approached Amara quietly. I've never seen anyone do that before, she said. Not here. Amara smiled gently, then simply nodded. Now you have. In the following days, small but noticeable changes followed. Security protocol was re-reviewed. A memo was circulated among courthouse staff on respecting boundaries and professional conduct. Judge Moore personally instructed bailiffs to ensure no unauthorized approach toward attorneys. During proceedings, none of it made headlines, but those who noticed understood. A shift had occurred, not explosive, but tectonic. And in legal culture, those are the shifts that last. Amara continued with her closing arguments. guiding the jury not toward outrage, but toward accountability. Her final slides contrasted department policy with the failure to report. She didn't accuse individuals, she illuminated systems. When the case was handed to the jury, she sat in silence, not praying, not hoping, just holding space for Darnell, for Malik, for her mother, for every quiet voice that had been talked over in courtrooms like this one. 2 days later, the verdict came in. Partial liability assigned to Officer Daniels, with civil damages awarded to Darnell's family. Hill, not named in the original suit, was referred for internal review on grounds of willful non-intervention. It was not a sweeping victory, but it was a marker, one that said, silence is not neutral, and neither is complicity. Outside the courthouse, Amara stood alone for a moment before walking toward the parking lot. She didn't celebrate. She didn't cry. But she knew power had shifted, not because someone fell, but because someone stood. When power moves that way, it doesn't return easily. Change did not begin with headlines. It began with memos. 1 month after the Darnell Hayes case, the district court quietly issued a revised set of safe interaction protocols for all courtroom participants. It wasn't televised, no press release, but every practicing attorney received the same updated policy. No individual, regardless of role, affiliation, or prior service, may approach or physically engage legal counsel during courtroom proceedings without explicit permission from the presiding judge. There was no mention of Amara, no mention of Hill, but their encounter lived in every line. Judge Rachel Moore, too, was different. She initiated a series of closed-door sessions with junior judges and court officers, advocating for training on unconscious bias and power boundaries. In one session, she broke her customary reserve. I watched justice nearly slip from our hands, not for lack of law, but for lack of moral courage. Amara was not present for those meetings, but Moore called her directly, not through clerks. I hesitated that day. Moore said, I won't hesitate again. Amara said little in return, but she understood the change was not performative. It was internal, institutional. Outside the courthouse, the legal community was shifting as well. The State Bar Association invited Amara to consult on a working draft titled Maintaining Ethical Safety in Adversarial Proceedings, a focus on the unspoken challenges faced by female attorneys, attorneys of color, and those who carried both. At a panel meeting, a Korean-American attorney shared, I was once screamed at by a witness in court for simply asking a statutory question. No one intervened. But after Amara's case, I know I was never the only one. And that was how a quiet coalition formed, not of slogans, but of professionals who had endured too much silence and now found alignment in their refusal to ignore. A working document emerged, real-time response guidelines to in-court intimidation. For the first time, bailiffs, clerks, and judges were jointly responsible for ensuring not only order but equal safety in the courtroom. Amara, meanwhile, declined interviews. She avoided media attention, but the letters still arrived handwritten, heartfelt. You showed me that the law isn't just what's printed in books. I used to think I didn't belong here. Now I think otherwise. One of those letters came from a second-year law student who, months later, interned in Amara's office. They said you changed how a courtroom breathes, he said. Amara smiled softly. She hadn't changed the courtroom. She had simply refused to yield to what was broken inside it. And that refusal sparked a quiet chain reaction. At the police precinct where Hill had once served, another ripple formed. An internal audit long delayed was reactivated. The results were stark. Over the past decade, 40% of force-related complaints listed officers present but not intervening. Not one had faced disciplinary review. Based on that data, a new policy was drafted, mandated duty to intervene and report use of force violations. For the first time, the language was direct. Willful non-intervention would constitute professional misconduct. The day it passed, there were no press conferences, but at a student-led symposium on institutional integrity, Amara was invited to speak. She brought no notes, no slides, just her voice. Systems don't collapse from bad actors. They collapse when good people stay silent. But that also means one person at the right time with the right stance can keep it from falling. The room fell quiet, not out of discomfort, but because each person inwardly was counting how many times had they, too, stayed silent. Gregory Hill sat alone at his kitchen table, a man long retired from uniform, but newly exposed by silence. It was late evening. The television murmured in the background, but he wasn't watching. In front of him lay a letter, not a subpoena, not a reprimand, just a notification. You are no longer eligible for advisory participation in courtroom. Proceedings pending final review. No explanation, no defense required, just distance. Hill read it twice, then again, not out of shock but because he had nowhere else to go that evening except inward. He had once prided himself on being one of the quiet good ones, the kind who didn't start trouble, the kind who followed the rules. But now he understood, not starting trouble had never meant preventing it, and rules were often written around the comfort of people like him. He replayed the moment. Tamara's voice calm but absolute, her posture steady, her refusal complete. He hadn't seen defiance. He had seen something far more dangerous to the old order, clarity. He would never speak about it publicly, but from that day forward, Hill began to say things he had never said, not loudly, but in rooms that mattered. That report doesn't sit right with me. Did anyone check the footage? You sure that's the whole story? It wasn't penance. It was beginning. Across town, Amara stood by her office window. The light outside was soft. She was reviewing a case, one of dozens, but paused, not because of fatigue, but because the silence reminded her of the courtroom. There had been no medals, no ceremony. But slowly, steadily, a new standard had formed. She saw it in how junior attorneys held themselves in court, in how judges acknowledged interruptions, in how witnesses, once careless with tone, now hesitated. And yet, she didn't think of victory. She thought of her brother Malik, now a teacher, who had once sat in a holding cell for wearing the wrong hoodie. She thought of her mother, whose arrest record was still technically sealed, but never really erased. She thought of the courthouse that had once doubted her, now carrying her fingerprints in its protocols. Justice hadn't arrived, but it had been forced to look itself in the mirror, and that, she knew, was more than most stories ever achieved. That night, she gave a small talk, not a lecture, not a protest, but a reflection. A room of students gathered, notebooks open, eyes alert. There will be days when silence feels safer than truth, she told them, but silence is not safety, it's permission. And power is not always who shouts loudest, but who remains standing when they are told to sit. A pause. No one moved. I did not win that day. I did not lose either. I remained. And sometimes that is all justice requires of us. Double quotes. Outside, the city went on. Sirens passed. Conversations bloomed and died. But in courtrooms, in classrooms, in precincts, something remained changed. Because justice is not a destination, it is a presence. And once it's seen, truly seen, it becomes harder to unsee, harder to undo. Hill looked at his reflection in the kitchen window. Not a villain, not a martyr, just a man who had once stood still and called it loyalty. And now, for the first time, he wondered what it would have felt like to speak.